Okay, everybody, thank you very much indeed for joining us for today's webinar from the MirYam Institute. As ever, I'd like to begin by expressing my profound thanks to my colleague Rosita Panini, co-founder and COO of the Institute. Rosita, thank you very much indeed for all that you do in order to bring these about. And also we'd like to thank our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer, our international coordinator. Alan, thank you so very much for bringing these about as regularly and often and as seamlessly as you're able to do. We very much appreciate it. So ladies and gentlemen, whether you're listening to our live cast or you're listening to our postcast by way of our podcasts, or you're watching this on television or at our YouTube channel, we welcome each and every one of you, one and all. Today we have a fascinating conversation. It's going to run for about 75 minutes from when I hand over the baton to our contributor, Dr. Ira Bedzow. But before I do so, I would like to introduce the two speakers from whom we have the opportunity and benefit to learn from today. The first is Itai Ater. He's a professor of business economics and strategy at the Coller School of Management at Tel Aviv University. Itai, who was born and raised in southern Israel, served as an officer in the vaunted IDF 8200 unit. He completed his undergraduate degrees in both law and economics with distinction from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Before heading to the economics PhD program at Stanford University, he worked at the Israeli Competition Authority. Itai's research examines the interactions between consumers, firms, and government interventions in different industries. He is particularly interested in understanding the determinants of Israel's high cost of living and how policy interventions in markets such as the real estate and food retail industries are effective in promoting competition. All fascinating subjects and very much at the moment, particularly against the backdrop of the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. In 2018 to 2019, he taught a course on the Israeli economy at University of California, Berkeley, in the United States of America, and he currently serves as a board member at the Israeli Fair Trade Commission and a research fellow at the Center of European Policy Research. Itai, we're so very pleased to have you here. And before I introduce your interlocutor, Dr. Bedzow, Ira Bedzow, I do want to tell everybody that you wrote a fascinating right of reply to an earlier webinar that we held about the state of Israel's economy in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd encourage everybody to look at that at miryaminstitute.org. Click on your profile on our commentaries page, and they will be able to read your particular insights on what I've already said is the most timely discussion and topic. Itai will be joined by Ira Bedzow, PhD. He is a publishing contributor at the MirYam Institute. Ira is a professor of medicine in the School of Medicine and director of the Biomedical Ethics and Humanities program at New York Medical College, NYMC, where he is in charge of the direction, oversight, and management of the Biomedical Ethics and Humanities program in the School of Medicine. He's also the UNESCO chair in bioethics at New York Medical College, which is part of an international network of institutes for medical ethics training. In addition, Dr. Bedzow is a senior scholar at the Aspen Center for Social Values, a network of socially minded individuals whose mission is to promote serious thought and to bring about a fresh and unique voice for social and societal challenges that confront the world today. On behalf of everybody here listening to this conversation, I'm delighted to hand this over to you, Ira. Please take us away for a wonderful discussion. And I remind our audience, this conversation will last for approximately 75 minutes. And Itai, as I said to you offline, so will I reiterate online, I greatly look forward to hearing your unique perspective and to learning from you by way of your particular insights. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Benjamin. Itai, I'll tell you, I'm actually really excited about this conversation, especially given the conversations that we've had previously. As an ethicist, I understand and I really appreciate the necessity to understand both economics and law as factors of influence on how people make decisions. But I would really like to hear more about you first. I know Benjamin gave us a little bit of a background, but I would love to know what made you interested in going first to law school and then to study economics. Like, why did you want to study both? What about these two fields separately and in terms of their intersection did you find so interesting and important to devote your academic life and research to?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Arya. Quickly about myself in terms of why did I go to learn or study law and economics. Going to study law, I was I think as a kid, I was a very talented chess player. And I used to play, I was like in international tournaments and so on. And at one time, I got an interview in a big newspaper, and they asked me whether I'm going to be a chess player when I grow up. And then I told them, my mother says that I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm my Yiddish mama. And then they asked me, oh, is that so? So do you consult with your mother also about chess? And then I told them, oh, you should know my mother. You don't consult with her. You should do what she tells you. So indeed, I went to go to law school, but then I realized that I want to do something else, not only law. And econ was something I was thinking about, I was fascinated about. So doing law and econ seemed logical for me. You should remember that in Israel, a law degree is an undergrad degree. So you go to the university and you do law. You can do law as an undergrad degree, which is different than what you do in the US, which is a graduate degree. So in that sense, a combination of law and econ was, for me, making sense. Why law and econ? I see myself as somebody that lives in a country and part of the society who wants to make an influence on what's going on in the society. And in that sense, thinking of both on law and econ is two powerful tools that any policymakers, any citizen need to know about in order to make a difference. And I think this is like in retrospect. I'm not sure that this is why I went to do this. I'm just thinking in retrospect what led me to study law and econ. These are the two main reasons why I did go, my mother, and then the fact that I want to be part of the society.
Well, it's funny, I was actually thinking about this as you're speaking. Studying law and economics in that order really speaks to the chess player in you, because the chess player needs to know the rules of the game, but also then needs to know, given the rules of the game, what is a strategy to make the best moves to optimize your positions, which fits very well with getting a foundation in law and then learning about economics to apply that type of strategic thinking to economics and political activity.
Yes, I think that we will talk more about econ, what does it mean, but a central part of thinking about economics is thinking about, and game theory, which is part of economics, is thinking about strategically, what are you going to do, what your rival is going to do, and then taking this into account and optimizing your decision based on what other people are doing. Think about this in the context of any trial in the context of law, and also in the context of economics. You're totally right. So these are part of the econ profession and part of the legal profession. They're thinking strategically, and chess is part of this, like knowing the rules, obeying the rules, but doing the best that you can do within this context. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so if you don't mind me asking, just because we talked about Jewish mothers, what was your reasoning for doing a PhD in economics versus going and getting an MBA, or looking at economics from the more business aspect as opposed to academically? What are the differences, and why did PhD speak to you?
Yes. Okay. Great question. And let me say, so I went to law school, and then after law school, in order to become a lawyer, you need to spend a year as an intern. That's the way it works in Israel. So I did my internship at the Israeli Antitrust Authority, which deals with competition. And I think this is a fascinating area in many, maybe especially in Israel, where you think about the cost of living. But so I went to do this internship. And then, unfortunately, I spent most of my time, not most of my time, but a lot of the time there near the copier machine. And I was disappointed. I thought I'm going to do more than that. And then I said, okay, maybe I should do something else and not become a lawyer, not go to practice law. And then, okay, what should I do? And then I decided I wasn't planning at doing a PhD. But I had a good friend, and then one thing led to another, and I applied for a PhD. But PhD is very different than an MBA. An MBA, typically you do an MBA, it's a 2 years program, and after the 2 years, you go to work at typically a business company. You can go to consulting, you can go to an investment banking or whatever. PhD, the most of the PhD students, not all, go to university and do research. And a PhD program is typically 5 years, and it's vastly different, although, of course, some who do PhD go back to business, and some MBAs, of course, teach at universities. But PhD basically gives you the tools to do research, which MBAs typically don't do.
Is there a difference? I mean, I know you studied in Israel and you work in Israel, but you also did your PhD at Stanford. Is there a difference between academia in the United States and Israel? And I don't necessarily mean the politics of academia. I mean, in terms of the research, do you study the same phenomena that your colleagues in the US do? Or are economic topics of interest really dependent on the country that the person is in, or the society in which particular types of economic activity occurs? Like, how local versus global is economic research?
That's a good point. I think that first, I think the entire academia in Israel, not only economics, view the US academia as a frontier, okay? And this is like the model for most of the academia, not only in Israel. US so far, and hopefully it will continue to be like this. This is like the frontier of research. Of course, there are great institutions outside of the US, but the frontier is definitely the US. In terms of economics, that's also true. And we thrive to do the best, to be the best researchers, the best professors, and there are great universities in Israel. But always, you look, very often you look at what's happening in the US, and you are in a sense trying to imitate and learn from what researchers do in the US. In that sense, if as an undergrad or someone who wants to become a professor in the Israeli university, you very often want to spend time in the US and get the expertise and get the skills, acquire the skills that you learn at top US university. I went to Stanford, which is definitely a great university. There are some Israeli professors on the faculty at Stanford. Actually, in fact, my advisor at the PhD was an Israeli professor who is considered one of the top economists, especially in his field, surely top professor. He was my advisor, and I learned a lot from spending the time at Stanford. Now, in terms of the topics that we study, the challenge in economics is we think about economics as something general, that you can think about a general problem and think what is the problem and then solve this problem. Now, these problems could happen in Israel, in the US, in many countries, but the challenge is to think, and we'll give an example in a minute, to generalize this and say, okay, this is something I study now in Israel, but this could be relevant to something that's happening in the US also. I'll give you an example. One of my project talks speaks about price transparency. The fact that you can observe the prices when you're sitting at home of different products, okay? And the idea is, okay, once you see the prices and it's easy to see the prices, maybe there is going to be more competition because retailers or sellers won't want to encourage you to buy their place and they will reduce the prices. Okay, price transparency is something general. Now, in my study, I apply this in the context of supermarket prices. This is something that happened in Israel. But now in the US, there's a new reform, a new way to make prices transparent in healthcare. Okay, and if you now you can see prices transparent in healthcare, maybe that would reduce the cost of healthcare spending and medical spending in the US. So you take a general concept of price transparency, and then you try to apply this in different settings, maybe in Israel, maybe in the US, but you want to see what are the general lessons that you can learn from that.
Well, so since we're talking about price transparency, and I know we're going to get into this later also, but I'm going to ask it now. I understand you're looking for ways to apply a phenomenon, let's say in Israel, to how you can learn from it in the United States and vice versa. But when you look at supermarkets or healthcare, they're always embedded within a context, right? So for example, like the groceries that an American would buy, or what they think are necessities, or they have, a more inelastic demand for, might be very different than in Israel, based on culture, not necessarily only based on tariffs or based on transportation costs and so forth. And then also with healthcare, the view of price transparency will be affected by the societal perspective of whether you think healthcare is a public versus a private good. So how do you tease out all this embeddedness to be able to find relatability?
So that's a challenge. And sometimes people would say, okay, what you found is very interesting, but this is interesting for Israel and might not be relevant for the US. And for me, it's, if I want to be a well-known, world-known professor, I need to make this understandable or interesting for audience outside of Israel. And sometimes I cannot do it. And instead the people say, wow, this is interesting, but not enough interesting for the general public, okay? There's a saying also that, if you do a work on, let's say, schools, elementary schools, and if you do it on a school in Tel Aviv, people would say to you, okay, this is the public school in Israel are not so interesting. And so this is not interesting enough, okay? But whenever you do a same study on a school in Boston, then if it's a school in Boston, this is interesting for in the entire world. So,
well, I'm sorry, but Boston public schools are amazing. Obviously, it's going to be interesting for everyone in the world.
Yes, so for US Americans, if they just pick one school in Boston, that's enough for the entire world to be interested in this. I'm not sure this is true, but this is definitely the reality that if you do something, a study on a setting which is outside of the US, you need to convince a typical US reader that this is interesting also for him. And for me, I'm an Israeli, so of course I'm interested in stuff that's going on more in Israel, but I'm trying to convince other people that what I'm doing here is also relevant outside.
So I do want to talk about your price transparency research, but before we do that, because I think it'll frame it very well, you gave me the last time we spoke a very different frame for how to view economics. Like I always saw economics as a way of distribution or optimizing the distribution of goods and services, where supply meets demand at a certain price. But you looked at it a little bit different. You didn't look at it simply about distribution of goods. You looked at it more about the people who are engaged in the transaction. So would you tell us a little bit more about that type of frame of description of economics and how that applies?
Yes, so we had a conversation a few days ago, and we talked about this, and I thought about it afterwards also. And there is two main definitions, not mainly definition, I guess, but there are two main definitions for economics. One definition starts with this idea that there are scarce resources, okay? You cannot have it all, and you need to decide who gets what, and the economics is telling us a solution for that gives some sort of distribution, who gets to produce, who gets to consume things. This is like one definition that speaks about what is economics. And this is like, well, I think this is what typically people who study law, this is what they think about economics. There is an alternative definition. They're not, I think they're complementary. They're both fine, they're good definition, but the other definition speaks about economics as a way to describe how firms and individuals behave. In what sense? The basic notion is that individuals or firms have incentive, they have a motivation, they have an objective, and they want to achieve that motivation, and they have incentives, okay? And they respond to incentive. And we're trying, using this alternative definition, to basically understand what people do, okay? We're not thinking about scarcity or efficient distribution. We're just trying to understand how individuals behave and what are the incentives that affect their decision. And over the last, I guess, maybe 20 or 30 years, this second definition that focuses on incentives, I think has become much more prevalent. In a sense, when people speak about the economic profession, especially in the context of the academia, sometimes they call the economics some sort of imperialist science, okay? Because economists think about, they can understand or they can explain any decision if they're thinking that they can understand the incentives, okay? And then economists apply whatever they want, whatever the tool that they get to different questions. Think about politics. They can think about who to marry, what to study. And everything they say, okay, what are your incentive? And then they apply this in different contexts. And this is very different than the initial definition that we thought about, this scarcity and efficiency, which is typically thought about in the context of law. In this, this is the first definition. So I think these are the two definitions.
It's funny. I feel through that definition, not to push myself into this, but this is where ethics really falls right in between law and economics. Because if you look at law, at least through like a positive law theory, law sets out internal constraints or norms imposed upon a person on what they can or should or cannot do. Economics looks at terms of preferences and interests and what people would want to do if they're pushed or nudged in certain ways, and you can manipulate behavior that way. Where ethics is sometimes inside, sometimes outside. You know, sometimes you see you have to comply to an external norm, and sometimes it's I'm doing what I'm intrinsically motivated to do. So yes. you look at how ethics both relies on law and economics, at least economics not from goods and services and scarce resources, but economics in terms of what pushes people to do certain things. And you can really see a huge intersection between the three fields.
Okay, no, that's fascinating. I think that, yes, so economics is in that sense, I'm happy to hear that the ethics and econ has certain aspects, common aspects, because typically as someone outside of ethics is you think about norm and moral, and often people think about economics or homo economics as people that are not necessarily related to norms and ethics, and mostly trying to profit maximizing. I'm not sure this is true, but this is like the general view of economics, which is different than ethics, and you say otherwise. So that's
well, no, it's funny. So maybe the assumptions of human nature might be different, but the process of decision making has a lot of intersection actually.
Okay, yeah. So the second definition of economics is mostly about the decision, the way that you make decision process. How you do make decisions. And this is driven by mostly incentive that you face. And that's, as you say, common to ethics.
Yeah. So I would love, since we're already talking about decision-making and how it relates to social behavior and so forth, would you mind telling us a little bit about the price transparency paper? Just in terms of how that price transparency gives information for people to make decisions, both as consumers as well as sellers. Because I think that's a really fascinating way of looking at how economics affects behavior.
Okay, so I'll give you a quick background. So 10 years ago, there was in Israel, 2011, huge social protests. So like hundreds of thousands of people going out to the streets demanding new policies in order to reduce the cost of living. I was like back from the US. I had 3 kids at home, and you just felt the cost of living in Israel very high, and high prices of supermarket prices and food prices. And then one of the implications of or results of this protest was a policy, a committee that was formed, and then there was a new act, new regulation that required supermarkets in Israel to post their prices online. So you can go online and see the price at each and every store before you go to the store, okay? And the idea was, okay, let's make it easier for consumers to actually see the price, and that would hopefully lead to lower prices. That was a motivation. Now, in reality, and this actually came to life, and now you can do that, but in reality, no one goes to these websites. You know, where you buy, you are lazy, it's difficult to do this comparison. It's not a gasoline price where you're the only one price. Now you need to do a basket of prices, and nobody goes to these websites. And I looked at this and tried to figure out, is this effective? Is this policy, price transparency regulation effective? And we do see that prices went down. And it's not because consumers went to these websites. And what we found, which I think is interesting, and then we can maybe generalize this also in the context of the US and the healthcare, is not consumers going to the websites, but instead we see that the media does it, okay? The media has a role in Israel, and not only in Israel, to do this price comparison. They want to provide readers the opportunity to know where to buy. And the media did this already before the price transparency. But before, the journalists had to go to the supermarket and wander across the aisles and pick items and so on, and to go maybe to 5 stores and so on. This was very expensive and not very smart. Now, when prices became transparent, the reporter could just log into the website and do this very easily, and then put this in the newspaper, okay? And this is a way that consumers first could learn about the low prices, and then sellers thought, okay, now the newspaper said that I'm having low prices, I can use this and advertise myself saying that I have low prices. So you have these media reporting about low prices. Next step, those retailers that get this positive coverage says, I can advertise myself as having low prices, and then you see some sort of competition among sellers to reduce the prices. So we see how price transparency is important, is effective, but not because consumers actually access the website, but rather because the media has an important role in that. Taking this into the context of the US, now let's say that you want to see which hospital you need to go to. It's very complicated to do this comparison. But if, let's say, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal helps you to do this comparison, then it could be effective. That's like the trying to generalize this context from Israel to the US. That's a hope in the sense that reducing the prices.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, when I read that paper, the first thing I thought of was the social aspect and the grand economic aspect of how price transparency allows for cheaper prices. But then I also thought about the assumptions about human nature. Like, for example, at first we talked about, or you mentioned how people are going to be lazy to go through all of these different websites and do the research and so forth. So therefore, the media helps to create the price reduction. Yes. But I was thinking about that in terms of, well, economics usually thinks of people as completely rational, not as lazy in terms of their assumptions. So then 2 things started happening to me. The first I thought was, well, look, I'm a satisficer, meaning I'm going to do research until I'm satisfied with the price, and then I'm not going to keep doing research to find the best bargain. By the way, my wife, on the other hand, is completely opposite. She'll do research until there's nothing left in the store. But there, I could still say it's rational because it's not that I'm lazy. It's that there's an opportunity cost to my time. And the opportunity cost to my time means I am now satisfied with this, but it also creates a market for the media knowing the opportunity cost of my time versus the opportunity cost on their time. So you see markets even within markets.
Yes.
But that takes a lot of interpretation and a lot of really digging out the material of human nature. Are economists reevaluating their assumptions on human nature now, and especially with relationship to psychology and cognitive sciences and so forth?
So first, I think, yes, clearly, yes. The economists are trying to understand what is a good explanation, what is a good theory that actually explains what individuals are doing. And if you have a theory that, just fails to explain what you see in reality, this is not a good theory. So of course it's a process and you cannot explain everything, but you want to have a good theory, is a theory that provide you insight on how individuals behave in maybe not 100% precise, but let's say for a good approximation. And it's a good point in the sense that over the last 30 years, there was a surge of psychology and economics. There's some sort of an understanding that if we want to provide good explanation or good description of how individuals behave, we need to take also insights from psychology. And I guess, and we all know that there were several Nobel laureates that emphasized this idea of econ and psychology. The first 2 Nobel laureates, actually one, Daniel Kahneman, is an Israeli, he's a professor now in Princeton, but back then, all the work that he did and got the Nobel Prize was done at the Hebrew University. He did it with his colleague back then, Amos Tversky. Amos Tversky didn't get the Nobel Prize because he was already dead when the Nobel Prize was given. But in any sense, they were the pioneers in understanding that you must take concepts and ideas from psychology. Tremendous impact on economists. And the idea is how you can take these psychological insights, understanding that they are incredibly important, and import them into economics. I'll give you maybe two, let's start with one. Let's say we think about pricing decision, and do we think about fairness as something that firms take into account when they price their decision? If we think about traditional economics, then fairness is not part of the story. Fairness is, it's the classic economics would say we are profit maximizing, and individuals are homo economicus, and we should not think about fairness. But Daniel Kahneman, for instance, was pushing this, saying that fairness is part of the story, and we should think what are the implications of fairness on firms' pricing decision. And this is not only psychology, this is not maybe, fairness is not the classic psychology, but this is just one example that we should move away from just thinking of such pure mathematical ways, but actually use psychology in this.
So I do want to talk about fairness, but I just want to actually just say one thing about Daniel Kahneman. So my introduction to Daniel Kahneman wasn't through economics, interestingly enough. It was through his one of his first books on attention and capacity theory. And it just, again, shows how psychology, or like assumptions that we make about human nature and the choices that we make, is really the foundation to many other disciplines in the social sciences. Yes. But with regards to fairness, like fairness could be seen both either as a constraint on economic modeling, or as a factor within what we want to study in an economic model. And one of the studies that you have that I think really looks at this is in terms of your paper on the right to counsel, because it looks at an issue of procedural justice, but then looks at, if you introduce a norm or a right related to procedural justice, you may have unintended consequences, which you only really be able to parse out through economic study. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that, about that research, I think it's a really good introduction to how economics plays into social thinking and social values.
Okay, so I have a paper on the right to counsel. And the idea is that you want to provide or give arrestees the ability to a lawyer, that they'll get a lawyer for free when they get arrested. And this was a reform that took place in Israel about 20 years ago. And we studied what were the consequences of this reform. And we, in a sense, the first findings are, let's say, quite intuitive. You see that indeed arrestees are getting lawyers, they're using the lawyers, and they're getting better outcomes. In a sense, they're less likely to be arrested, or if they get arrested, they spend fewer days under arrest. That makes sense. But the other things that we find that in this study is that it also had an effect on the police, on the way that the police behave, and also on crime. In what sense? Now, after this reform took place, the police, in a sense, understand, okay, it's not so easy for me to arrest somebody and take him into custody, okay? So we see that the police do fewer arrests. That also could be fine. This is great. Instead of the police, just seeing somebody on the street and taking him into custody, sometimes you don't want this to happen, okay? But the next step is that we see that when the police do fewer arrests, you see also the crime going up. Okay, so this is like, there's a trade-off. Okay, on the one hand, it's good that arrestees get the ability to defend themselves at the court, but once you give them this right, you see also that crime goes up because the police is less active. Okay, so this is like a classic, I think, trade-off that you can think about economics. There's a good side and the bad side. What is the right or what the optimal decision? It's not so always clear. But I must say that those who advocated this policy surely focused on the good side of this. You should think about there's could be other negative consequences for this type of policy. And this is something that we try to highlight in this study. Okay.
So there's two questions on this one. The first is, I understand you have the data that when people have a right to counsel, crime goes up. But how are you able to determine whether that's simply a correlation or there's a causative relationship there? And then second, once you recognize, if you can, that there is a causative relationship, is it the economist who then gets to decide how to balance that trade-off, or how do economists then play the normative role in the type of policy making? Like, where do they fit?
Yes. So the first point about causality, how do you know that the crime went up because of this reform? Okay. So what we do there is the reform took place in Israel in different regions in different times. Okay. So let's say it started in Tel Aviv region and then moved to Haifa and then to Beersheba and so on. And it was taking place, the rollout was staggered. It wasn't happening at the same time. And what we do in order to argue that this is indeed causal, we see that the impact in Tel Aviv, which was the first region for this reform to be implemented, we see there that the police reduced the number of arrestees and crime went up in Tel Aviv. But this did not happen in Haifa, where the reform didn't take place yet. When did it happen in Haifa? Only after the reform started to take place in Haifa, and then in Beersheba, and then in Jerusalem. So we exploit this staggered rollout of the reform to argue that the reform, this is what driving the change in number of arrestees and the police activity, and then in crime. Okay, so this is what we're trying to move from just correlation into causality in this context of this paper.
Can I interrupt you for a second on this? Because this is something that, especially because economics is so social, this is always a trouble that not necessarily I have, but that I think needs to be explained also. So, like, for example, there's this classic correlation that as people buy more ice cream, murders also go up. And you can even see this where, in the Northern Hemisphere, people buy more ice cream and murders go up, and not at the same time as the Southern Hemisphere. Like, they actually are in reverse. And, people try to say, oh, so there must be a correlation between, I know you're laughing here, between ice cream and murders. But really, they're both related to the fact that both ice cream consumption and murders increase in the summer versus the winter time. So how do you, when looking at this, rollout of rights and increase in crime, how do you make sure that they're not related to, they're both not related to a third variable?
So we're trying,
sorry about that.
No, that's a good question. I think that this is like when you do economics and in my type of research, you're always confronted with the question whether it's just correlation or is it causal relationship. And you want to argue this is causal, and then somebody else may argue, okay, there could be a third variable, like the summer in the example of ice cream and murders or something else. And way we do this is that arguing that Tel Aviv and the fact that it was implemented in Tel Aviv and then in Haifa and then in Beersheba, they are not so different in many aspects, okay? And we argue that the main aspect that differ between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa and Beersheba and all the regions is the time of the implementation of the reform. And if somebody would come up, no, Tel Aviv and Haifa are different in many other aspects that affect the crime level and so on, then we are in a problem, okay? And this, like, our job is to show, and this is what we do in the paper, that they are not so different, and especially the main difference is when the reform was implemented. And this is a challenge. We're not always successful in doing that, and to the extent that we are, then it's easier to do it for us to make the study better. Thinking about the best way to do it is to do an experiment, like thinking about the COVID-19 vaccination. Then Pfizer did some sort of an experiment, giving some people the vaccine, and some they gave them placebo, and then they try to figure out what happened to them. But this could be done in the context of a vaccine, but you cannot do that in the context of a reform of giving people a lawyer, okay? And this is a challenge for economists studying question that you cannot do an experiment and you still want to get an answer. And this is what we do here. It's not always as clean as an experiment, but still I think it's valuable in terms to figure out, is it causal or not? And this is what we do there.
Right.
Now, you asked me about the what do we do with that, in a sense?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? What do we do with this finding that, okay, more lawyers help arrestees, but on the other hand, increase crime? So what we do in economics, often we do some sort of what we call a cost-benefit analysis. We put numbers and say, okay, these are the numbers, and do some calculation and say, for our perspective, this is good or bad. But I think these type of calculation always or very often involve moral judgment. Okay, how much you value somebody that is arrested for doing nothing? What's the problem? How costly it is? Or on the other hand, how costly it is that there is increase in crime? And then putting numbers, it's not so easy. And I think this is something that maybe ethics or moral judgment are really important. And I'm not sure that always economics and this type of decision or thinking is very effective. So we can highlight the trade-off. We can say, okay, if you give people lawyers, then crime would go up. But saying what exactly at the level that we should stop, whether it's good or bad, I suspect we're not so good at it.
Yeah, well, it's funny, Itai. I mean, this here is like a very good limiting test, because there's a big difference between a right and a preference, right? Like a right can't be traded off. Whereas a preference, there's going to be a trade-off. There's going to be a point where one preference will be more attractive than another, given the costs of both of them.
Yes.
A right, there is none. It's a constraint on the model.
Yes, but so here we call it the right to counsel. This is a right, so we should give it to them. I think people could say, okay, you give it to them. This is their right, but it has a cost. And at what sense you should reconsider this cost? Sometimes it's an easy answer, sometimes it's not. I think in the context of vaccines these days in Israel, we are happy that there's a great rollout of the vaccines, a great success, but still some people don't want to take the vaccine. When is it that you can force them, or what are the conditions that you can, what are the sanctions that you could put on people who don't want to get the vaccine? They have the right on their body, but on the other hand, the fact that they don't get vaccine, the vaccine has implication on other people. I think this is like a very, very interesting question on the border between right and preferences, and what are the costs for them and for other people. I totally agree.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I would say with regards to public health and healthcare delivery, I don't think we focus enough on the relationship between ethics and economics. Like I know, I'm sure you're aware of him, Uwe Reinhardt, who focused a lot on the recognition that sometimes the questions of what should we do gets transferred into questions of, okay, well, what does it cost us to do? But they're not exactly the same questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this is true, and I think like moving it into the cost, it makes it more practical, but it's still also abstract from the actual question. Yes.
Yeah. So there was one thing you were telling me, pandemic related, that you were working on with the city of Tel Aviv, which I would love to know more about. I think our viewers would also love to know more about, because it looks at, one, the relationship between the pandemic and economics, but it also shows that even if PhDs are not like MBAs that go into business, they have a very firm hold on what business is like, to be able to make suggestions for firms and governments to make strategic policies or make strategic decisions on how to move forward. So if you don't mind, tell us what you're doing with the city of Tel Aviv because of the pandemic.
Okay, so I'm working now with Tel Aviv municipality, and Tel Aviv is concerned, and the municipality is concerned. I think about COVID-19, and right now my work with Tel Aviv municipality focuses on the real estate market, and in particular the rental market in Tel Aviv. The idea is that there's a lot of concern because COVID, its impact in terms of the economic impact was mostly among young individuals Those individuals typically had, they did not have a lot of tenure at the job, and there were the unemployment among youth, young individuals skyrocketed, especially in Israel, also in other places. And those households, those young households, typically rent. They don't own houses, but rent. And Tel Aviv, about 50% of housing units in Tel Aviv are for rent. Okay, so this is a vibrant city, a lot of young, this is like the great thing about Tel Aviv, you can go out, you can enjoy, but this is mostly because there's a lot of young population in Tel Aviv. And now comes COVID, and the concern is that it would be very difficult for people living in Tel Aviv with the high rents to keep living in Tel Aviv. And I'm working with Tel Aviv municipality trying to understand how did rental market responded to this, and how did businesses, how many were shut down, how many, what happened to the rent. And the idea is, the thinking is that even after COVID, people will work from home more, okay? You understand that you can use Zoom to work from home. You can understand that you need not go to the workplace every day, and people may go out of the city and live outside of the city. And the Tel Aviv municipality is trying to think strategically, what are the implications of COVID? First, in the short run, on people now living Tel Aviv, and then in the long run, if and after COVID, what would be effect of the change in the work-life balance and people moving outside of Tel Aviv on the vibrance of the city, on the livelihood of the city. And we're still in the process of thinking what the best way to approach this. And just to compare Tel Aviv to New York or San Francisco, these cities also see a lot of issues with many people cannot afford living in the city these days with a high rent and with high unemployment. So I think this is, I'm working with Tel Aviv municipality, but surely this is not something which is specific to Tel Aviv. This is going back to what we said before. You're trying to think about a problem in a specific setting and then argue that this is not only specific to that context, but it's also more generalizable to other cities in the US and elsewhere.
This may be a both and question, but just I'm trying to think about the municipality and the government of Tel Aviv contacting you. Like, is there concern a loss in tax revenue? Is there concern that an empty city would increase crime? Like, what are they worried about with regards to people leaving Tel Aviv to go to the suburbs or other areas?
So I think they're concerned about many things, and that's I don't think that loss of revenues from taxes is one thing, but I think they understand that especially the city like Tel Aviv, I think maybe this is also like Manhattan or San Francisco. The magic of Tel Aviv builds on many young individuals that live in the city and go out and enjoy the city 24/7. Okay. And they are concerned that this, if something changed, and it's interesting that the magic of Tel Aviv, maybe you can describe why is it like this and give many reasons, but in a sense, sometimes you cannot put the finger and say, this is because of this. And then you're concerned that if something gets lost on the way, this is very bad, and you want to avoid that. And they are concerned and they want to be hands-on in terms of understanding if things going in the bad direction, and they want to understand what's happening. So this is the thing, I like it in the sense it's not that they give you a specific mission. They just, okay, let's see what's going on in the city and let's see if we are losing it in a sense, and they are trying to solve this. So saying what can we do in order to prevent people leaving Tel Aviv? What should we do in a sense? Let's see. I think, but let me just, in terms of the bottom line in that sense, if I'm comparing Tel Aviv to New York, in that sense, so far we don't see that many people are living in Tel Aviv. If I'm comparing the numbers that I see, things in Tel Aviv are not as bad in terms of what I see in New York, at least reading in the media. Of course, the open, it's not excellent as it was before the COVID, but it's not as bad as we would be concerned.
So this is I find this actually very, very fascinating to me, because what I see this in terms of interest and incentives, Understanding what the problem is, and the problem not necessarily people are leaving, but the underlying reason why people are leaving, almost gets you part of the way to what the solution is, right? So for example, if people are leaving because the magic isn't there in Tel Aviv anymore, but the magic is because the pandemic is causing lockdowns, then it's an external constraint that could go away, right? Like it's a temporary. If people are leaving because the magic's not in Tel Aviv, but the magic is now going to be in another city, then people leaving doesn't mean they're not coming back because it's not temporary anymore. Now there's competition between municipalities.
Yes, so Tel Aviv is not concerned about competition in that sense.
Right.
I think there is a concern that if you can work from home and you don't need to commute to work, so maybe I can live further away, and one thing would lead to another, and then people would live outside and get used for that I don't live in the center of Tel Aviv, and this is part of the concern. So it's not like competition, but nevertheless some sort of a new trend of not going to work every day, which might happen after COVID. With the online and working from home and so on. So this is something that they are concerned. I'm not sure they can really do something about this, but they want to be aware of that and see what can they do, or think at least what can they do in that context. But I'm just saying that people sometimes think about the academia as an ivory tower and so on. I think that at least in my way of thinking, I'm working with Tel Aviv municipality. I'm doing some consulting for firms. I'm doing work with the government of Israel and trying to use tools of economics in order to promote policies. And I think there's common understanding that both can benefit from these tools. And I think this is important. And this is true for me, but also true for many other people also in the US. This combination. So we are trying to do this right combination in terms of work and helping governments and so on.
No, I'm of the same school. I think academia is best when it's not in an ivory tower, but it's among the people and dealing with real world problems. Yeah. Having the ability to both be an outside observer, but really integrated into the firms or the communities or the people that you're trying to both study and help makes you relevant. And makes it possible for you to see reality for what it is, as opposed to for what you imagine you want it to be. So that's where academia is best.
I think I totally agree, and I think this is what I like. I wouldn't like it if if at least my job wasn't like this. If it was completely not part of the real world, I wouldn't like it. I couldn't be part of this, at least. And this I'm happy about this ability to do this combination, or to do this together with real world. Or yes, definitely.
Yeah. So there's one more thing. I guess it's more of a trying to clarity and understanding that I need to have, and I think it would be good for the viewers also. So when I went to school, they always divided things into microeconomics and macroeconomics. But the way we've been talking the whole time, we've been speaking about individuals, but we've also been speaking about community and society and government and policies and big picture also. So what is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics? I mean, is it a false dichotomy, or is there a real difference of study between the two?
There are two, actually, they're different, but not so different in a sense. I think, of course, if you go to undergrad in economics, you do the micro classes and the macro classes, and they're different. And the micro classes, as we spoke over the last in this conversation, is mostly about firms' decision, individual decision. We're trying to understand how individuals respond to incentive and so on. But while we think about macro, the typical phrases that we use is like economic growth and unemployment and currency and deficit and stuff like that. And indeed, there are different terms and different emphasis, but often, and they're in a sense different, but yet the tools that people are thinking, or which type of policies to implement and which type policies are effective, is still using the type of incentives. If I change the tariff, or if I reduce the interest rate, how would that affect individuals? How do that affect firms? So there are incentives also in macroeconomics. So macroeconomics would be typically questioned at the state level, at the country level, but even there, you're going to use these ideas of incentives in order to understand or evaluate what's going to happen. Okay, so I think there's, on the one hand, different in terms of the level of the conversation and the terms that you're using, but in terms of what type of skills or what type of thinking you're applying, there could be very much the same.
Is there assumptions of what incentivizes people versus groups the same, or how people make decisions similar? Or another way of putting it, is an individual or is a community an aggregate of a bunch of individuals, or is it something that's unique unto itself?
That's a good point. I think that going back, whether we discuss this idea of psychology and economics, so far, like let's say when we took the idea of psychology and applied it into the context of economics, the beginning and most of the work is think about individuals being affected by psychology and making decisions that are affected or driven by psychology. At least in the beginning, and this is changing, but not so quickly. When we're thinking about firms or government and so on, we don't think about psychology as very important in this context thus far. So we think about firms are rational, they would do a process of thinking and they make the best decision. Individuals be more biased by psychology, but firms not so much, and also not government. I think this is like where the trend started, but now people understand that also groups and firms and governments are pretty much affected by psychology and other types of biases. Of course, if you think about governments, then politics is part of the story, okay? And politics and these type of preferences, so we're thinking it's much more difficult to understand how a group makes a decision, because you see there's a lot of people with different preferences. This is part of the difficulty, but this is part of the job when we're thinking about macroeconomics, trying to figure out the decision of a group of individuals.
Let me ask you this, with regards to macroeconomic thinking, does it make a difference? I mean, I'm sure the answer is yes, but so I'll say, how does it make a difference with regards to different government or political structures? For example, you have a country who has very short term limits of 2 years or 4 years for their elected officials, versus a government that can have a vote of no confidence, versus a government that has much more long-term term limits. Does that affect the rationality of economic decision making just by virtue of the short-term versus long-term thinking and planning?
So surely it has a great impact, a great effect, yes, but I'm not sure this is the rationality. I think it would make, you would say, it would make perfect sense for a political leader to make different decision if he knows that he has a limited time in office or not. Okay, so it's not irrational. It's perfectly rational from his side, taking into account the fact that he has a limited role time in office or not. Okay, so I don't think that this is like an example of psychology. It's simply taking this constraint and doing the best that he can based on that constraint. Okay, think about this like political leader, but that's also for, I don't know, CEOs. Okay, CEOs that makes decision for the firm, and the type of bonuses that they're gonna get depending on also affect their decision. Of course, these are the incentive scheme that they face, and they do the best that they can based on that incentive scheme. So I don't think this is like a psychology question. It's just trying to optimize given that the constraint that they are facing. Yes, so this is the way it is, and we need to take these constraints into account when we try to understand what they're doing, in a sense.
Well, I will tell you, the way you're describing it reminds me a lot of how I advise people when they're having moral challenges in healthcare, or any type of organizational situation. People will always have 2 layers of interests: self-interests because of who they are, and also self-interest as a representative of the firm or a representative of the country, whatever they are. And the best way to be persuasive is to show how those 2 interests align given the given the proposal that you're suggesting.
Yeah.
When you have a conflict between self and you as a representative, it never goes well. So.
I agree. So that's interesting. I think one of the basic framework in economics speaks about principal agent. So you are like an agent of a principle. And the question is, the difficulty happens when the incentives are not aligned. So you are the agent, you are the I don't know, you're the thing of the somebody that seller and then the firm, and whether the incentive is not aligned, this is where the problem arises, because he makes a decision that probably optimizes what he wants, and which is not always what the firm wants, and this is where the problem is. And you want to make the incentives the same, and that solves so many problems. And when they're not the same, issues arise and problems emerge.
Not to be pithy, but I always say in those types of examples, you have to make the invisible hand very visible. People need to recognize where their incentives are aligning, and if they're misaligning, in order to recognize where the problems might be.
Yes, make the invisible invisible. That's a good point. I'll adopt this.
You can use that if you want. That's fine.
Thank you.
So, we don't have a lot of time left. I would love to know in the remainder of the time where you see economics going, both in terms of where the research is going and where its influences might be in the next few years, in terms of some of the challenges that governments might be having, communities might be having, firms might be having. Both in terms of like material goods, but also just the changing social assumptions. You see a lot of people are now buying and selling not only goods, but brands or ideas, and how that is affecting economic modeling and research.
Yes, so I'll tell you two things that came up, I think, over the last 5-10 years, maybe more, which became more important. One is, and I think both of them are maybe more, at least as relevant for Israel and the US. The first one is inequality. So inequality wasn't a big part of the economic research, I think 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And it became much more important understanding whether inequality is an issue, how big an issue it is, to measure inequality, and then trying to figure out what are the implications of inequality on society. And just to give you a sense, I guess many of us know that inequality in the US has gone up tremendously over the last 30 or 50 years. And the question, okay, is this the case? And what are the problems with that? And this is what economists are trying to figure out. Also in Israel, inequality has gone up very, very rapidly. And I must say that in the last 10 years, we see some sort of a decline, surely not an increase in inequality. And we are trying to understand what drives this inequality. Is it actually going down? And what are the implications of this? Think about the COVID-19. COVID-19 also, what are the implications of COVID-19 on inequality, when you're thinking that most of the people that were hurt economically are people from the lower income, okay? While those who are upper income did not get hurt because of COVID, okay? So this is like, I think, one very interesting field in economics that is developing over the last 10, 15 years. The other issue is...
All right, before we get to this issue, if you don't mind, just like, I want to hear
Yes.
more about this, because you see a lot of this in two different areas. You see it, one, in terms of like the rise of economic nationalism, where like globalism allows for vulnerability. So we have a problem in terms of not being able to distribute or produce our own consumption. You also see it in terms of a big, it's going to be technical, but you can explain it, in terms of the critique on the Pareto optimality, in terms of people are saying, oh, this is an efficient organization, but it doesn't give us the goals that we actually want in terms of equity and justice. So how are people going to be looking at this differently at that point?
I don't have a good answer for that, but surely let me put it this way. First, inequality and globalization, how do they both of them relate to each other? And you think about this trade war between China and the US, what are the implications on an individual in the US? and is it good or bad? These are questions that people are trying to understand and figure out. And of course, it has a great deal of political impact, these type of discussion. And I don't think just jury has good answers of what are the actual impact of these inequality or decisions, which we see the clear relationship between policy decisions and then on inequality. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, why did economists avoided this type of question before? I think part of the answer is we thought about economists thinking about maximizing the pie. So we think trying to maximize the pie, this is what's important and this is what we're doing. We don't care how the pie is divided, but over the years is more understanding that we should also think about how we divide the pie. It's not only interesting about maximizing pie, but also how do we divide it? And this is about inequality. If we think about dividing the pie, we should think about inequality as part of the story. Okay, so that's it. I think there's like trying to respond to your excellent comments. I don't think there's a clear answer for that, but this is the way that we think about it. The other point that I want to touch is over the last 10 years, there is clear increase in concentration in the US, especially among high-tech firms. Think about, the big Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Amazon. And economists are trying to understand more and more, is it good or is it bad? Or what are, of course, are good things that we get many services for free. That's the easy part to say, but there's more research trying to understand what are the negative potential consequences of only few firms that have this huge power to make decision. And think about privacy also, how much they know about us. So we are like, in a sense, giving a lot of power to few people, high-tech people, very talented people, but trying to figure out what are the implications first on economic power and then also about privacy and stuff like that. And now there is more research about that, but still there's no clear answers. But surely there's also a lot of tension among these big firms and people who wants to make these firms not as big as they are. Let's see what happens. And I think also that also speaks to the politics. And you see that Democrats and Republicans might have different views on that. But I think this is like a big topic in research in economics, but not only in economics.
Yeah, I'll say, economics is already in this, but I think it's going to be a big area for at least education, if not also research, is to teach people the economic understanding of immaterial goods, like privacy. Like, yes, privacy is a right, but people give it away because they don't realize its value or its cost, which are not the same thing, right? But showing people that the use of economics and understanding like the choices that you make have consequences that are costly as well as beneficial in areas that you would never imagine, like signing, like clicking a button to consent to give away all your data. I think would be a very big value to consumers.
Yes, definitely. And just one more thing, I think the last area I think is going to be a new area is like COVID-19. So you see a crisis like this, it's like, I would say, like it's an opportunity you should not dismiss in a sense, like in terms of understanding what are the implications of something like COVID-19. It's also going to be, people will try to understand what are the implications of this huge worldwide pandemic. This is also something that would affect research in economics and the society in general. Yes.
Right. Well, so let me ask you on that one, because this is something that affects ethics a lot. People like to say, and I actually don't think it's true, and I think it's quite dangerous, that there's regular ethics and then there's, disaster ethics or emergency ethics, where all the old ethical rules get thrown out and then you bring in a whole new bunch of rules because we're now in a disaster situation. Where I, on the other hand, say, no, like a better analogy would be you have your everyday ethics is like, your regular season game, and your disaster ethics is like the championship, meaning like the rules are the same. You just have to be much, much better in order to be able to be excellent at that higher stakes situation. Yeah. Do you think that studying from the pandemic and COVID-19 is going to look at economics completely differently? Like there's disaster economics, or will the same rules of the game apply? They just apply better or worse depending on how skilled you are in economic decision making?
I'll give you an example. I think the details are the devil is in the details. Okay, and nowadays in Israel we're thinking about the vaccines, and some people don't want to get the vaccine, and there's a question that arises: should we force them to get the vaccine, or maybe not force them, but should we share the data with the workplace and the municipalities of those who did not get the vaccine? Okay, and there's a trade-off. Okay, once there is privacy, I don't want to get the vaccine. You cannot force me on this. Can you share this information that they didn't get the vaccine? And I think there's like, on the one hand, vaccines work and we should promote this and we should encourage them. But should we, in a sense, ignore these basic rights that people have in terms of privacy? And I think this is like one of the questions that we're asking and trying to figure out. So there's the big question about this ethics and economics and so on. But now people are trying to gouge or figure out in a specific context. And I think this is an interesting time in the sense that these questions come up and you need to give an answer for that. And in this example, I don't think that we should share this information, but I think we can come up with example where it's not so clear what should we do. And this is like, in a sense, this is interesting. I don't have a good answer for anything, for everything, for sure. But the COVID, this extreme situation makes you think about things that you haven't thought about in normal times, for sure.
Well, I'll put it this way. I hope that normal times come soon. Number
Yes.
one. And number two, that we are able to continue these types of conversations, both during normal and abnormal times, because this past hour or so, I think I've learned more about economics and policy and politics and the state of or relationship between business, psychology, and economic decision making than I did in my entire schooling that I've had. So I want to thank you so much for your time and just the clarity of your presentation of economic principles. I also want to thank Benjamin and Rosita and Alan for allowing us to have this conversation and facilitating it. And also I want to thank the viewers for allowing us and allowing the MirYam Institute to be able to keep putting these types of presentations together. I hope that you and I will, I'm sure, talk offline, but I hope we can also have other conversations like this in the future to talk about ethics, economics, law, as it relates to both Israel as well as in the United States. So, Itai,
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, the MirYam Institute, Alan, Benjamin, everyone. That's a pleasure for me as well. Thank you very much.